They said she brought death with her, but Ethan Cole had seen enough lies to know when silence was hiding the truth. And the moment his horse slowed to a stop at the edge of that broken street, he felt it in the air before he saw it, a weight that didn't belong to wind or dust, something heavier, something that settled into a man's bones and stayed there. The town stretched quiet under a pale morning sun. Wooden storefronts standing like witnesses that refused to speak, doors half open, curtains barely moving. And right there in the center of it all, she knelt, small against the wide dirt road, her shoulders trembling, her head bowed, dark hair falling forward like it was trying to hide her from the world that had already decided what she was. Ethan didn't reach for his gun, didn't call out, didn't even dismount at first, because the scene didn't feel like something you rushed into. It felt like something you stepped into slowly, the way a man steps into cold river water, knowing it might take more than it gives. The bodies lay scattered around her, not in chaos, but in a pattern that felt wrong, too still, too quiet, like the end of something that had no witnesses left to argue over it. And yet the town already had its story ready, whispered from porch to porch, carried in tight mouths and narrowed eyes. Apache girl, they said, like that explained everything, like that made the world make sense again. Ethan finally swung down from his saddle, boots hitting, the ground soft, dust rising just enough to catch the light. And he walked forward with the kind of slow certainty that made men nervous without knowing why. His eyes not on her at first, but on the ground, on the spaces between things, on what wasn't being said. He noticed the marks in the dirt, the faint impressions left behind by boots, not moccasins, not soft-soled prints that faded into the earth, but hard edges, straight lines. Men who walked like they owned the land beneath them, and he followed those signs the way a tracker follows truth, not with hurry, but with patience. The girl didn't move when he got closer, didn't look up, didn't plead, and that told him more than any words could have. Because guilt makes noise, fear makes movement. But what she carried was something else entirely, something that stayed still even when everything around it tried to break it. Then he saw her hands, clenched tight around something small, something that caught the light just enough to draw his eye. A broken string of beads, dark red and bone white, scattered where the thread had snapped, and for a moment, just a moment, Ethan felt the ground tilt under him, because he had seen those beads before. Years ago, in a place far from here, around a fire where no one spoke louder than the night, in his mother's hands, turning them slow like they held stories instead of wood and color. He stopped a few feet away, close enough to hear her breathing, uneven but steady, like she had already cried everything she had to give and was left with whatever came after, and still she didn't look up. Behind him, a door creaked open, then another, and boots began to gather, slow at first, then with purpose. The town waking up not to truth, but to judgment, and Ethan didn't need to turn to know what was coming. He could feel it in the way the air shifted, in the way men stand when they think they're right, even when they're not. A voice cut through the quiet, sharp and certain. The sheriff, step away from her. Cole, this ain't your business. And Ethan almost smiled, not because it was funny, but because it was familiar. The same words men always used when they wanted something to stay buried. He finally looked at the girl, really looked, and saw not a threat, not a killer, but someone carrying something too heavy to put down. And he glanced back at the ground again, at the tracks that came in but didn't leave, at the story written in dust that no one else seemed willing to read. And he knew, right then, before a single word was said, before any rope was raised or judgment passed, that this town wasn't afraid of her. They were afraid of what she proved. And as the sheriff took a step closer, hand hovering near his belt, Ethan didn't move away, didn't reach for his gun. He just stood there, quiet as the desert itself. And in that stillness, something began to shift, something no one could quite name, because sometimes the loudest thing a man can do is refuse to step aside. The sheriff stopped a few yards away, boots pressing into the dust like he wanted the ground itself to agree with him, his shadow stretching long in the morning light. And behind him the townsfolk gathered in a loose half-circle, not too close, not too far, the way people stand when they want to watch something happen without being part of it. Ethan could feel their eyes on his back, weighing him, measuring whether he would step aside or stand his ground. And for a long second nobody spoke. just the dry wind moving through the street, carrying the faint scent of smoke and old wood. Then the sheriff cleared his throat, voice steady but tight around the edges. "I said this is not your concern, Cole." And Ethan finally turned his head just enough to acknowledge him. Not fully, not in submission, just enough to show he had heard, and that he was choosing not to obey. The girl shifted slightly then, just a breath of movement, her fingers tightening around the broken beads, and Ethan noticed the way she held them, not like evidence, not like something she feared would be taken, but like something she refused to let go of, something that mattered more than the fear pressing in from all sides. A murmur passed through the crowd, low and restless, words half spoken and half swallowed, and Ethan caught fragments. She was here. No one else around. You know what her kind brings, the kind of talk that filled gaps where truth should have been. He let it pass over him without answering, his attention drifting back down to the ground, to the faint lines drawn in dust and gravel, and he crouched slowly, one knee lowering, hand hovering just above the surface as if he could feel the story there without touching it. The sheriff took a step closer, impatience showing now. "You planning on studying the dirt all day?" he said, trying to sound confident, but the edge in his voice betrayed something else, something closer to unease. Because a man who looks too closely can make other men nervous. Ethan did not answer right away. He traced the outline of a boot mark with his eyes, then another, counting without speaking, following direction, spacing, the way they overlapped, the way they did not scatter. Finally he spoke, quiet, almost to himself. They came from the north side, and that was enough to stir the crowd again, heads turning, some glancing toward the edge of town where the road bent out toward open land. The sheriff frowned. "So what?" He replied quickly, too quickly. "They came, they did what they came to do, and she is still here. That is all anyone needs to know." But Ethan shook his head once, slow, controlled, and stood back up, brushing dust from his palm. He turned more fully now, facing the sheriff and the gathered townspeople, not aggressive, not challenging, just present, and that presence seemed to take up more space than it should, like a quiet truth that refused to shrink. "They came," Ethan repeated, voice even, "but they did not leave the way you think." And a man from the crowd stepped forward, older, hat pulled low. "What are you saying, Cole?" he asked, not angry, just uncertain, like someone who had built his understanding on something that might be starting to crack. Ethan did not rush his answer. He looked back at the ground once more, then toward the buildings, the doors, the windows, the places where people had watched instead of acted, and finally back to the girl, still kneeling, still silent. "I am saying," he continued, "that if you look close enough, you can see who walked in, and you can see who never walked out, and you can see what kind of boots they wore." And that last part hung in the air heavier than the rest, because everyone there knew the difference between a traveler passing through and a man who lived on that land. The sheriff's jaw tightened, his hand dropping a little closer to his belt, not drawing, not yet, but ready, and Ethan noticed, not with alarm, just with awareness, the way he noticed everything else. The girl finally lifted her head then, just enough for Ethan to see her eyes. Dark and steady despite everything around her, and for the first time there was something in them besides grief, something like recognition, like she understood that someone else was finally looking at the same truth she had been carrying alone. A gust of wind moved through the street, lifting dust and loose paper, brushing past boots and skirts, and for a brief second the whole town seemed to pause with it, as if waiting to see which way things would turn. Ethan reached down slowly, careful, and picked up one of the loose beads that had fallen from her hand, turning it between his fingers, feeling the worn surface, the slight imperfections that came from being shaped by hand, not machine, and he held it up just enough for the light to catch it, not as proof, not as an accusation, but as a question no one had answered yet. "This does not belong to a killer," he said softly, and though his voice did not rise, it carried, because truth does not need volume when it finds the right moment. And in that moment, the town did not look at the girl anymore. They looked at each other, and that was where the real story began to show. The bead caught the sunlight for just a second longer than it should have, and Ethan lowered his hand slowly, not as a man proving something, but as a man letting others see what had been in front of them all along. And that was when the shift began, Not loud, not sudden, but quiet, like the first crack in ice that no one wants to acknowledge. A woman near the back stepped half a pace behind her husband, her fingers tightening around his sleeve, and a younger man glanced down at his own boots. Then quickly away, as if the ground itself had started asking questions he did not want to answer. The sheriff saw it too, and that was when his voice hardened, pushing against the doubt before it could grow roots. "Enough of this," he said, louder now, sharper. "You are reading stories into dirt and trinkets. Cole, that girl was found here, and that is what matters." But even as he spoke, his eyes flickered once, just once, toward the same tracks Ethan had been studying, and that was all it took for the silence to deepen. Ethan did not raise his voice to match. He simply took a step to the side, opening the space, inviting the others to look for themselves, and that small movement carried more weight than any argument, because it said he had nothing to hide. "Then look," Ethan said, calm as dry earth. "If I am wrong, you will see it the same way you have been seeing everything else." And for a moment no one moved, because looking meant risking being wrong, and being wrong meant something far heavier than pride. Finally, the older man who had spoken before stepped forward, slow and careful, his boots pressing into the same dust, his eyes tracing the same lines, and Ethan watched without interfering, without guiding, just letting truth do what it does when given space. The man crouched, squinting, following the marks, his brow tightening, and then loosening, then tightening again, like a door opening and closing inside his mind. And when he stood back up, he did not look at the girl, he looked at the sheriff. "These prints," he said, voice quieter now, less certain of the story he had been repeating, "they are not hers." And that sentence did not end anything, but it started something that could not be easily stopped. A ripple moved through the crowd, not panic, not anger, but something more uncomfortable, something closer to awareness. And the sheriff took another step forward, faster this time, trying to close the space Ethan had opened. "You are letting doubt take hold where there should be none," he said. But the words did not land the way they had before. They felt thinner, like they had lost something along the way. The girl's eyes lifted again, not fully, but enough to watch, and Ethan noticed the way she did not interrupt, did not defend herself, did not plead, because she had already done all of that somewhere else, at some other time, and it had not mattered then. He turned slightly toward her, just enough for her to see that he was not leaving, not stepping back, and for the first time, her grip on the beads loosened just a little, not in surrender, but in relief so small it could have been missed if you were not looking for it. A breeze moved through again, carrying dust across the street, soft against boots and wood, and Ethan followed it with his eyes, watching how it settled into the tracks, how it revealed the depth, the direction, the truth, written in simple lines that did not lie. "They came together," he said, more to the air than to any one person, "and they stayed together." And he pointed, not accusing, just indicating. No scattered steps, no chase, no sign of struggle, just a line in and no line out. And that last part settled into the crowd like a stone dropped into still water. The older man nodded once, slow, almost unwilling, but unable to deny what he was seeing, and another stepped forward, then another, each one bending just enough to look, not all the way, but enough to feel the shift under their feet. The sheriff's hand hovered near his belt again, not because he meant to draw, but because he no longer knew what else to do with it, and that uncertainty showed more than any confession could have. Ethan took a breath, steady and controlled, and let it out slow, his gaze moving from one face to another, not judging, not accusing, just waiting. Because sometimes waiting is the hardest thing a man can do. When truth is standing right there asking to be seen. The girl finally rose, slowly, carefully, her movements measured, and she stood beside him now, not behind, not in front, just beside, and the space between them felt different than it had before, less like distance, more like understanding. No one stopped her, no one reached out, because the moment had shifted beyond that, beyond simple blame or quick answers, into something quieter and heavier. Ethan closed his hand around the bead once more, then opened it again, letting it rest in his palm as if offering it back to the world. And he spoke one more time, softer than before, but clearer than anything else that had been said. "Truth does not shout," he said. "It waits for someone to listen. And the town, for the first time that morning, did not answer right away. And if you have made it this far, watching a man choose silence over fear and truth over comfort, then leave a comment and like this video, because stories like this are not about noise. They are about the moment everything changes without a single shot being fired. The silence did not break all at once. It thinned, like fog lifting slow from the ground, revealing shapes people had chosen not to see, and Ethan felt it before anyone spoke. The way a man feels a storm turn before the sky admits it. The sheriff shifted his weight, boots scraping lightly against the dust, and that small sound carried farther than it should have, because now everyone was listening for things they had ignored before. This proves nothing, the sheriff said, but his voice had changed, not weaker, just different, like it no longer believed itself the way it used to, and Ethan did not answer him right away, because some words only matter after they have been allowed to sit. Instead, Ethan walked past him, slow and steady, toward the far edge of the street where the tracks grew clearer, where fewer feet had disturbed them, and each step he took drew eyes with it, pulling the crowd along without asking. Because curiosity has a way of moving people when certainty begins to fail. The girl followed a pace behind, not clinging, not hiding, just there, her presence no longer. Something the town could pretend did not exist, and Ethan could feel it, the weight of her standing, of her choosing not to run even when no one would have stopped her now. He reached the edge of the prints and crouched again, brushing aside a thin layer of dust with the back of his hand, revealing deeper impressions beneath, older, untouched by the morning wind, and he pointed without looking back. These were made before the rest, he said, voice low, steady, before anyone gathered, before any story was told. And a few of the men stepped closer, hesitant but unable to stay back, their boots pressing into the ground beside his. One of them knelt, then another, each one tracing the marks the way Ethan had, following direction, spacing, the silent language written in dirt, and slowly, one by one, their expressions changed, not all at once, not dramatically, but enough to be seen if you were paying attention. They came from inside the town. One of them muttered, almost under his breath, but it carried anyway, because truth does that. It finds its way out even when whispered. Ethan nodded once, not in triumph, not in accusation, just acknowledgement, and he stood again, turning back toward the street, toward the buildings that now looked different than they had an hour ago, less like shelter, more like witnesses. The sheriff remained where he was, but his stance had shifted, his shoulders not as squared, his hand no longer hovering with purpose. And when Ethan met his eyes, there was something there that had not been there before, not guilt, not exactly, but the recognition that the ground he had been standing on was no longer solid. You said she was found here. Ethan spoke, calm as ever. But these tracks say something else, and he let that hang, did not finish it, did not press, because forcing a truth too hard can make men push back against it. The older man stepped forward again, slower now, more careful with his words. If they came from inside, he said, glancing around, then someone here knows who they were. And that was the moment the silence changed shape, from uncertainty into something sharper, something that turned inward instead of outward. People looked at each other now, not at the girl, not at Ethan, but at familiar faces that suddenly held unfamiliar weight, and that was harder to face than any outsider ever could be. The girl stood still beside Ethan, her gaze moving across the crowd, not accusing, not searching, just watching, as if she had been here before, not in this place, but in this kind of moment, where truth hung in the air and no one wanted to be the first to touch it. Ethan felt the bead still resting in his palm, warm, now from his hand, and he closed his fingers around it once more, not to keep it, but to remember what it stood for, a thread broken, a story interrupted, something that had not been allowed to finish the way it should have. A door creaked open somewhere behind them, slow, hesitant, and every head turned at once, the sound louder than it had any right to be, and a man stepped out onto the wooden porch, his face pale under the morning light, his eyes not meeting anyone else's, and he stopped. There, just standing, as if the distance between the door and the street had suddenly grown too wide. No one spoke to him, no one called his name, because they all saw the same thing at the same time. The way his boots were dusted, not from standing still, but from walking, and walking recently. Ethan did not move toward him, did not reach, did not accuse. He simply stood where he was, steady as stone, and let the moment unfold the way it needed to. Because sometimes the strongest thing a man can do is give the truth room to arrive on its own. The wind picked up again, softer this time, brushing past the buildings, lifting a thin veil of dust between the street and the porch, and through that shifting haze, the man finally looked up, not at the sheriff, not at the crowd, but at Ethan, and in that look there was something fragile, something on the edge of breaking, and Ethan held his gaze without judgment, without anger, just presence, the kind that does not demand, only waits. Behind him, the girl took a slow breath, steadying herself, and for the first time since Ethan had arrived, the town did not feel like it was closing in on her. It felt like it was opening, not wide, not welcoming, but enough to let something true pass through, and in that narrow space, everything that had been hidden began to press forward, waiting for the moment when silence would no longer be enough. The man on the porch did not move at first, not forward, not back, just stood there with the weight of every eye in the town pressing against him, and Ethan could see it in the way his shoulders held, too stiff, too careful, like a man trying not to shift under something already too heavy to carry. The wind passed again, softer now, lifting the edge of his coat just enough to reveal the dust along the hem. The same pale color as the road Ethan had traced, the same fine layer that clung to boots, that had walked where they should not have. No one called his name, but they all knew it, and that silence carried more meaning than any accusation ever could. The sheriff turned slightly, just enough to place himself between the man and the growing doubt, but he did not step closer, because even he felt it now, that something had already moved beyond his reach. Ethan took one slow step forward, not toward the porch, not closing distance, just enough to show he was still present, still watching, and that was when the man finally spoke, his voice low, uneven at the edges. "You do not understand what happened here." And it was not a denial, not fully. It was something else, something that tried to stand without falling apart. Ethan did not answer right away. He let the words settle, let the man hear them himself in the quiet that followed. And then he said, calm and steady, "Then help us understand." And there was no challenge in it, no threat, just an opening, a space, where truth could step forward if it chose to. The man's gaze dropped for a moment, not to the girl, not to Ethan, but to the ground between them, to the same dust that had already begun to tell its story, and his hands tightened at his sides, not in anger, but in something closer to restraint. Behind Ethan, the girl stood still, her breathing slower now, steadier, as if each moment that passed without judgment pressing down gave her a little more space to stand in her own life again. The older man from the crowd shifted closer, not with accusation, but with the careful curiosity of someone who had already seen enough to know he needed to see more, and he spoke quietly. "Those tracks, they lead from your door." And the words did not land like a strike, they landed like a weight, something that settled into the center of the street and stayed there. The man on the porch closed his eyes briefly, just long enough for Ethan to notice, just long enough for everyone to see that whatever he had been holding back was no longer steady in his grip. When he opened them again, he looked not at the sheriff, not at the crowd, but at the girl, and for a moment there was something like recognition there, something that did not belong to hatred or fear, but to memory. Ethan followed that glance, and something inside him tightened, not in anger, but in understanding that this was no longer about what had happened. It was about why. The sheriff took a step forward then, his voice rising again, trying to reclaim ground that had already shifted. "We do not need stories," he said. "We need order." But even as he spoke, fewer people looked at him, fewer people held on to his words, the way they had before, because once doubt takes root, it does not let go easily. Ethan kept his gaze steady on the man at the porch, and he spoke again, softer this time, but clearer. "Order built on the wrong truth does not hold." And that sentence seemed to move through the crowd slower than the others, deeper, because it was not just about this moment, it was about every moment that had come before it. The man's shoulders dropped then, just a fraction, but enough to show the shift, enough. In pieces, and each piece asks a little more of the people who choose to see it. And as the man on the porch prepared to say what came next, The entire town held its breath without even realizing it. Because somewhere between silence and confession, everything that had been hidden was about to find its way into the light. The man's words lingered in the air like dust that refused to settle, and Ethan did not move, did not press, because he knew the next piece would not come from force, but from the weight already building inside that man's chest. The porch creaked softly under his boots as he stepped down one more inch, not fully committing to the street, not retreating either, caught between two places the same way his truth was caught between silence and confession. They were not from here, he continued, voice steadier now, but still carrying the strain of something long held back. They came asking questions about land, about something buried, something they believed was theirs, and a murmur rippled through the crowd again, softer this time, not sharp with accusation but dull with realization, because this was no longer a story about one girl, it was about choices made behind closed doors. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion but in focus, following the thread the man was finally letting loose, and he spoke quietly. And you helped them. Not as an accusation, not as a judgment, but as a simple placement of fact into the space that had been waiting for it. The man did not deny it, his shoulders dropping further, the last of his resistance slipping away. I showed them where to look, he admitted, his voice barely above a breath. I thought it would bring something good, something for this town. And that sentence carried more weight than any defense, because it was not about malice. It was about a mistake dressed as intention. The sheriff shifted again, but this time he said nothing, because there was no ground left to stand on that did not already belong to the truth unfolding in front of him. The girl stood still, her eyes fixed on the man, and for the first time there was something in her expression that moved beyond grief, something like recognition of the path that had led here, not forgiveness, not yet, but understanding that this had never been as simple as they had tried to make it. Ethan took a slow breath, the kind that settles a man before the final turn, and he looked back at the tracks, then at the man, then at the girl, connecting the pieces not with words but with presence, letting everyone else follow if they chose to. They came. Ethan said softly, you guided them, and then something changed. And the man nodded. Once, a small motion but enough. They did not find what they expected, he said, and they did not want to leave empty-handed. And though he did not describe what followed, he did not need to, because the silence around him filled in the shape of it without crossing any line that needed not to be crossed. The crowd shifted again, quieter now, each person holding a different part of the truth, piecing it together in their own way, and slowly. The focus moved away from the girl entirely, settling instead on the choices that had brought this moment into existence. Ethan turned slightly toward her then, not fully, just enough to show that he saw her, not as a symbol, not as a blame to be carried, but as a person who had been standing in the center of something she did not create, and she met his gaze for a brief second, steady, unafraid, and in that look there was something shared, not words, not promises, just a quiet understanding that truth had finally found a place to stand. The man on the porch took another step down, his boots touching the dirt now, the same ground that had told the story before he ever spoke, and he looked at the sheriff, then at the crowd, and finally at the girl, and he said, she tried to stop them, and that sentence landed differently than all the others, because it did not explain, it revealed. A hush fell over the street, deeper than before, the kind that comes when something undeniable settles into every corner at once, and no one rushed to fill it, because there was nothing left to argue against. Ethan did not smile, did not react outwardly. He simply stood there, letting the truth complete its own path, because it no longer needed him to carry it. The sheriff lowered his hand fully now, not in surrender, but in acceptance that whatever authority he thought he held had already passed to something stronger than him, something quieter. The girl's fingers loosened completely around the beads, and she let them rest open in her palm, no longer clinging, no longer guarding. And for the first time since Ethan had arrived, she stood without the weight of accusation pressing down on her shoulders. The wind moved again, soft and steady, carrying the last of the dust across the street, smoothing over the tracks that had spoken so clearly, as if the land itself was ready to let the story rest now that it had been heard. Ethan closed his hand one last time around the single bead he had held, then gently placed it back into her palm, not as a gift, not as a gesture, but as something returned to its rightful place, and he stepped back half a pace, giving her the space that had been taken from her. No one spoke, no one moved to stop her as she stood there, because the moment had shifted beyond judgment, beyond fear, into something quieter and more honest. And in that stillness, Ethan turned slightly toward the road he had come from, not leaving yet, not fully, but ready, because his part had never been to stay, only to stand when standing mattered. The town remained where it was, caught between what it had believed and what it now knew. And the girl remained in the center of it, no longer alone, not because someone toward the road again. It was not an escape. It was a release. Behind him, the town shifted in place, not moving forward, not stepping back, caught in that narrow space where truth demands something but does not tell you what. The sheriff exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering as if a weight he had not acknowledged before had finally been placed where it belonged. And he took a step back, not toward authority, but away from it, letting the space open where it had once been tight. The man who, space where there had been none, and the street that had once held her in place now opened in front of her. She did not rush, did not hesitate either. She simply took a step forward, then another, walking through the space they had made, not as someone leaving, but as someone reclaiming the ground beneath her feet. Ethan watched her pass, the sound of her steps soft against the dirt, steady, unbroken, and for a moment, everything else faded. The town, the people, the tension, all of it slipping into the background as something simpler took its place. She stopped when she reached him, not directly beside him, but close enough that he could hear her breath, even, controlled, and she held out her hand, the beads resting in her palm. Ethan looked down at them, then back at her, and for a second, neither of them spoke, because some things do not need to be said out loud to be understood. Then she closed her hand gently and lowered it again, not giving them away, not holding them back, just keeping them. And she gave the slightest nod, a gesture so small it could have been missed, but Ethan saw it, and he returned it in kind. No words, no thanks, just acknowledgement, and that was enough. Behind them, the town remained quiet, not frozen, but thoughtful, the kind of stillness that comes after something has shifted and people are not yet sure what to do with it. The sheriff stepped forward once more, but this time his voice was different, not commanding, not certain, just measured. Land began, and she did not look back. Ethan mounted in one smooth motion, the leather creaking softly under his weight, and he did not urge the horse forward right away. He let the moment stretch just a little longer, letting the quiet settle into something that would remain long after he was gone. When he finally turned the horse, it was slow, deliberate, and he rode out the same way he had come in, not chased, not called after, just allowed to go. The town watched him leave, not because he had changed them, but because he had shown them something they could no longer ignore. And as the distance grew, the sound of hooves fading into the open land, the street behind him remained, quieter than before, heavier, but also clearer, because out here, justice does not need a loud voice. It just needs someone who refuses to walk away, and someone else who is willing to stand once the truth arrives. That was the way it should be, because whatever tied that moment together did not belong to distance. It belonged to understanding. Ethan studied her for a second longer, the way she stood, balanced, grounded, not like someone waiting, but like someone who had finally found where she could stand without being pushed aside. And he gave a slight nod, though he knew she would not see it from that far. And then he turned forward again. The land opened wider as he rode on, the horizon stretching out in soft layers of light and dust. And the silence out here was different from the silence in the town. It was not heavy, not holding anything back. It simply existed, steady and honest. He reached into his pocket without thinking, fingers brushing against something small, and for a moment he expected to feel the bead still there. But it was gone, returned where it belonged, and that absence felt right, like something set back into place after being carried too long. Behind him, the town would move on. It always did. People would talk, argue, question, maybe even change, or maybe not as much as they should, but that was not his to decide. What mattered was that for one moment, when it could have been easier to turn away, someone had stayed, someone had looked closer, and someone else had found the space to stand. The horse lifted its head slightly, ears turning toward a distant sound, and Ethan followed its gaze to the wide stretch of land ahead, where nothing waited except more road, more sky, more silence. And he let out a slow breath, the kind that comes when a man knows he has done what he could and nothing more is needed. Back in the town, the street would still carry the marks of what had happened, even if the wind had begun to smooth them over, and the people who had stood there would carry something too, something that did not fade as easily as dust, something that would stay in the way they looked at each other, in the way they spoke, in the way they chose not to, the next time a moment like that arrived. And the girl, she would walk her own path now, not defined by what had been placed on her, but by what she had endured, without letting it break her. And that kind of strength does not ask for recognition. It does not need a witness. It simply continues. Ethan adjusted his hat slightly against the sun, the brim casting a shadow over his eyes as the light grew stronger, and he urged the horse forward just a little more, not in a hurry, never in a hurry, because out here, time did not need to be chased. It moved at its own pace, and a man either matched it or got left behind. The wind rose once more, carrying with it the faintest trace of something from the town, not sound, not words, just the feeling of a moment that had found its place, and Ethan let it pass through him without holding on. He did not think about what would come next, did not try to shape it, because the road would take care of that the way it always had. And somewhere behind him, in a town that would remember longer than it expected, a girl who had once stood alone now stood in a space that had been opened not by force, not by fear, but by the simple act of someone refusing to walk away. And that was enough, more than enough, for the kind of justice that does not need to be spoken out loud to be real. The sun had climbed higher by the time Ethan reached the low ridge that overlooked the valley beyond, the kind of place where a man could stop without calling it a stop, just a pause in the rhythm of the trail, and he let the horse slow on its own, the animal's breath steady, unbothered by the miles behind or ahead. He rested one hand on the saddle horn and looked out across the land, long stretches of pale grass bending under the wind, distant hills softened by heat, and for a moment, everything felt simple again, the way it does when there is nothing left to prove and nowhere you have to be except forward. But even in that quiet, the morning stayed with him, not loud, not demanding, just present, like a shadow that moves with you without asking. He thought about the way the town had gone still, the way truth had not arrived like a storm, but like a slow turning of heads, and how one man's voice, when it finally came, had not needed force to be heard, only the absence of lies. Ethan shifted slightly in the saddle, adjusting his weight, and the leather creaked soft under him, a familiar sound that grounded him in the present, and he reached down to steady the reins as the horse stepped over a shallow dip in the earth. Behind him, miles away now, the town would already be changing in small ways, not in grand gestures, not in sudden apologies, but in the quieter things, in the way people paused before speaking, in the way eyes lingered a little longer when they met, in the way a story once told with certainty now carried a question at the end of it. And the girl, Nayeli, she would not be the same either, not because she needed to change, but because the weight that had been placed on her had finally been lifted, and that kind of release does not shout, it settles deep, allowing a person to stand where they always should have been allowed to stand. Ethan did not smile at the thought, not out here, not alone, but there was something in the way his shoulders eased, something in the way he let the horse choose its path along the ridge instead of guiding every step, that spoke of a man who knew when a moment had reached its end. The wind picked up again, stronger now, pushing against him, carrying the dry scent of the land, and he tilted his head slightly into it, letting it pass over him the way he had let the morning pass, without holding it, without resisting it. A hawk circled high above, its shadow moving across the ground in slow arcs, and Ethan followed it for a second, watching the way it rode the currents without effort, trusting the air to carry it where it needed to go. And there was something in that, something familiar. He thought about the bead again, not in his pocket now, but in her hand, where it belonged, and how something so small could hold a story that changed everything once it was seen clearly, and he understood, the way men like him eventually do, that it was never about the bead, or the tracks, or even the words spoken in the street. It was about the moment someone chose not to Look away. He nudged the horse forward, leaving the ridge behind, descending slowly into the open stretch beyond, where the trail widened and the land offered no obstacles, only distance. Somewhere far off, a line of clouds began to gather, thin and scattered, not yet a storm, just a hint of something that might come later, and Ethan did not concern himself with it. Not yet, because out here, you dealt with what was in front of you, not what might be. The sound of hooves against the earth settled into a steady rhythm again, a quiet beat that marked the passing of time without measuring it, and Ethan let it carry him, the same way it always had, from one place to another, from one moment to the next, never staying too long, never leaving too soon. He did not know where the road would lead him next, and that was the way he preferred it, because a man who tries to map every mile ahead often misses what is right beneath his feet. And back in that town, where the dust had begun to settle and the people had begun to speak again, something would remain, not visible, not something you could point to, but something that would shape the next choice, and the one after that, in ways they might never fully understand. Ethan adjusted his hat once more, pulling the brim lower as the sun brightened, and he leaned slightly forward in the saddle, a signal to the horse that it was time to pick up the pace, just a little, and the animal responded without hesitation, moving into a smoother stride that carried them both further into the open land. And though the distance between him and that moment grew with every step, the truth of it did not fade. It stayed where it belonged, in the quiet understanding that sometimes the strongest thing a man can do is stand still when everything around him expects him to walk away. And sometimes that is enough to change a life that was never meant to be broken in the first place. By late afternoon, the light had softened into that quiet gold that stretches shadows long across the land, and Ethan rode without urgency, the horse beneath him steady as ever, each step measured, each breath even, as if neither of them felt the need to outrun anything that had already passed. The ridge was far behind now, the town no longer visible, but something of it remained, not as a burden, not as a question, but as a kind of settled truth that moved with him the way the horizon always did, present without pressing. He passed a narrow stream cutting through the earth, its water low but clear, reflecting the sky in broken lines, and he guided the horse down toward it, not because he needed to stop, but because moments like this asked for stillness the same way truth had asked for it earlier that day. The horse lowered its head to drink, and Ethan slid down from the saddle, boots touching the ground with a soft thud, the familiar weight of the land steady beneath him. He crouched by the water, dipping his hand into it, letting the coolness run across his fingers, washing away dust that had gathered without him noticing, and he watched the ripples spread outward, small circles widening until they disappeared into the flow, and there was something in that motion that stayed with him, the way one small disturbance could move through something larger without leaving a mark once it settled. He stood again, wiping his hand against his coat, and looked out across the open stretch ahead, the sky widening above him, the air carrying that quiet sense of distance that only comes when there is nothing to block your view. Behind him, somewhere far beyond sight, the town would be shifting in ways that could not be measured by miles, people speaking in lower voices, perhaps avoiding certain names, perhaps asking new questions, perhaps choosing silence where once there had been certainty. And whether they changed fully or only slightly did not matter as much as the fact that something had broken open, and once that happens, it never quite closes the same way again. Ethan returned to the horse and rested his hand briefly against its neck, feeling the warmth there. The steady life that did not question, did not doubt, just continued, and he mounted again in one smooth motion, settling back into the rhythm that had carried him across more miles than he cared to count. The trail ahead curved gently toward a line of distant hills, and he let the horse follow it without guiding too tightly, trusting the path the same way he had trusted the moment earlier, not forcing it, not shaping it beyond what was needed. The wind shifted direction slightly, carrying a cooler edge now as the day began its slow turn toward evening, and Ethan pulled his coat a little closer without thinking, his gaze moving across the land with the quiet awareness of someone who had learned to read more than just tracks. Somewhere out there, beyond the next rise, beyond the next stretch of open ground, there would be another place, another moment, another choice waiting to be made, and he did not search for it, did not anticipate it, because the road had a way of bringing those things when they were ready, not when you were. He thought again, briefly, of the girl, not as she had been when he first saw her, kneeling in the dust with the weight of everything pressed down on her, but as she had stood at the edge of the town, steady, grounded, no longer carrying what was never hers to bear. And that image stayed clearer than anything else, because it was not about what had happened, it was about what had been restored. The beads in her hand, the broken thread, the story that had nearly been buried beneath the wrong kind of certainty. All of it had found its place again, not through force, not through argument, but through the simple act of someone choosing to look closer. Ethan adjusted his hat slightly as the sun dipped lower, the brim catching the last of the light, and he leaned forward just enough to signal the horse to keep moving. Not faster, just steady, always steady. The sound of hooves against the ground carried on, a quiet rhythm that marked the passing of time without needing to count it, and the land stretched ahead without end. The kind of openness that did not promise anything, but did not take anything away either. And as the distance between him and that moment grew, the meaning of it did not fade. It settled deeper, becoming part of the way he saw the next place, the next person, the next story that might unfold in front of him. Because out here, on roads that did not belong to anyone and yet carried everyone who dared to follow them, justice did not ride in loud or fast. It arrived in the space between steps, in the pause before a man chose to move on, and in the quiet strength of those who refused to be defined by what others placed on them. And Ethan Cole rode on with that understanding, not carrying it as a weight, but as something lighter, something that did not slow him down, only reminded him when the next moment came, that sometimes the smallest choice to stay can change, more than any journey ever could. Evening came slow across the land, not in a rush, but in layers, the gold fading into amber, then into a deeper shade that stretched long across the ground. And Ethan let the horse ease into a quieter pace as the lights softened around him. There was a kind of stillness that only arrived at this hour, not empty, but full in a way that did not ask for anything. And he rode through it without breaking its rhythm, his silhouette stretching ahead of him across the dirt trail like something that belonged to the land more than to him. He did not think about stopping yet, but he knew he would soon, not because he was tired, but because a man learns to listen to the day the same way he listens to truth, knowing when it has said enough. A cluster of low trees appeared ahead, scattered along a shallow bend in the land, their shadows pooling together in a darker patch that offered rest without promise, and Ethan guided the horse toward them, not in haste, just in quiet agreement with the moment. The air cooled slightly as he reached the edge of the shade, and the horse slowed on its own, grateful for the pause, lowering its head as if it understood the language of the land better than any man could. Ethan swung down from the saddle again, boots settling into the earth with the same steady weight, and he loosened the reins, letting the animal graze where it chose, trusting it the way he trusted most things that did not pretend to be something they were not. He moved a few steps away and rested his back lightly against the trunk of one of the trees, arms loose at his sides, gaze drifting out toward the horizon where the last of the light held on. It had been a long day, not in miles, but in moments, and those were the kind that stayed with a man longer than any trail ever could. He thought about the way the town had stood still, the way a single truth had unraveled something that had been held too tight, and he wondered, not with doubt, but with quiet curiosity, how long it would take before that place found its balance again, or if it ever truly would. Some towns never did, some carried their silence like a scar, something that shaped them in ways no one spoke about, but everyone felt. Others changed slowly, learning from what had been revealed, letting it guide the next choice, and the one after that, until something better took root. Ethan did not know which kind that place would become, and it was not his place to decide. He tilted his head slightly, listening, not for sound, but for that deeper sense that told him when a place had settled, and out here, away from it all, the land felt steady, untroubled by what men carried into it and left behind. The horse shifted a few yards away, the soft tearing of grass the only sound breaking the quiet, and Ethan let his eyes close for a moment, not to sleep, just to rest in the stillness, to let the weight of the day find its place without needing to hold on to it. When he opened them again, the sky had deepened, the first hints of dusk stretching across it. And he pushed himself off the tree, moving without hurry, every motion measured, every step unforced. He checked the saddle, adjusted the straps slightly, the kind of small task that grounded him in the present, and then he rested his hand once more against the horse's neck, a simple gesture that asked nothing and received everything it needed in return. Somewhere far off, a faint line of light marked where the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the land began to cool in earnest. The warmth of the day giving way to the quiet of the night, Ethan took one last look across the open stretch, and for a brief moment, he thought again of the girl standing at the edge of that town, not looking back, not calling out, just standing in a place that had finally made room for her. And that image settled into him in a way that did not demand anything more. He mounted again, the motion smooth, practiced, and he turned the horse slightly, aligning with the trail that would carry him forward into whatever waited next, because that was the way of it, not staying, not holding, just moving when it was time. The first stars began to show faintly above, small and distant, but steady, and Ethan rode on beneath them, not guided by them, but accompanied, the way a man is accompanied by the things he has seen and chosen not to forget. And though the road ahead held no promise, no certainty, it held something else, something quieter and more enduring, the understanding that out here, the greatest changes do not come from force or noise, but from the moments when someone chooses to stand, to see, and to leave the world just a little more honest than they found it. And that was enough to carry him into the night. Without looking back, night settled fully over the land, not sudden, not heavy, but complete, the kind of darkness that did not hide things so much as soften them. And Ethan rode beneath it with the same steady pace, the horse sure-footed even as the trail narrowed into a thinner line barely visible under starlight. The world had grown quieter now, the sounds of the day replaced by something deeper, the distant call of night birds, the low whisper of wind moving through dry grass, and the soft rhythm of hooves that had become almost like a heartbeat against the earth. He did not light a lantern, did not need to, because out here a man learned to see in ways that did not rely on brightness, learned to trust the shape of the land, the pull of the path, the way the air shifted just slightly when something changed. He leaned forward just a touch, resting more of his weight into the movement, not from fatigue, but from familiarity, letting the ride carry him rather than guiding every step. Somewhere along the trail, he slowed the horse again, not because anything demanded it, but because something in the quiet called for it, the same way the moment in the town had called for stillness before. Truth had shown itself. He dismounted without sound, boots pressing into the cool ground, and he walked a few steps ahead, eyes adjusting to the subtle shapes around him, the faint outline of a rise in the land, the darker line of trees beyond it, and he stopped there, not looking for anything, just standing. Sometimes a man pauses not to think, but to listen to what has already been said, and the day behind him still carried a voice, not in words, but in the feeling it left behind. He thought again of the silence in that street, not the kind born from fear, but the kind that follows understanding, when no one needs to speak, because something has already been seen clearly. That kind of silence was rare, and it stayed with a man longer than any loud moment ever could. He drew a slow breath, the cool night air settling into him, and he let it out just as slowly, not holding on to it, not pushing it away, just letting it pass. The way everything else had passed, the horse shifted, slightly behind him, waiting, patient as always, and Ethan turned back, resting his hand against its neck for a brief moment, feeling the steady warmth there, the quiet certainty of something that did not question, did not doubt, just moved when it was time to move. He mounted again, the motion smooth even in the dark, and he guided the horse forward just enough to clear the rise, revealing a wider stretch of land beyond, open and unbroken under the stars. The sky above was clearer now, filled with more light than the ground below, and he lifted his gaze for a second, not searching, just acknowledging the vastness of it, the way it stretched without end, the way it held everything and judged nothing. Behind him, far beyond sight, the town would have settled into its own night, doors closed, voices lowered, and somewhere within it, the truth that had been uncovered would begin its slow work, not loudly, not all at once, but steadily, shaping the way people would remember, the way they would choose. The next time they stood at a moment that asked them to look closer, the girl would carry it too, not as a burden, but as something reclaimed, something that had nearly been taken from her and then returned, not by force, but by someone refusing to let it be lost. Ethan did not wonder where she would go next, because he knew that kind of strength did not need direction. It found its own path the same way the land did, winding where it needed to, steady where it could be. He adjusted the reins lightly, guiding the horse along the faint trail that curved toward the darker hills in the distance. And he felt the quiet settle deeper around him, not empty, but full in a way that only comes when nothing is being hidden. The night did not ask anything of him, did not demand anything in return. It simply allowed him to move through it, carrying only what he chose to carry, and leaving the rest where it belonged. And as he rode on, the memory of that moment in the town did not fade. It settled into him in a quieter way, no longer sharp, no longer pressing, but steady, like a line drawn across the land that could not be erased once it had been made. Because out here, under a sky that had seen more stories than any man could tell, the things that mattered most were never the loudest, never the ones that demanded attention, but the ones that stood quietly and refused to move. And in that kind of stillness, a man could find his place without needing to claim it, could leave something behind without needing to stay, and could ride forward knowing that sometimes the smallest moment of truth is enough to carry through a lifetime of open road. By the time the first hint of dawn began to touch the far edge of the sky, Ethan was still riding, not because he had to, but because the road had not yet asked him to stop. And out here, a man learns to listen to that kind of thing more than to his own thoughts. The stars had started to fade, one by one, not disappearing all at once, but giving way slowly, the way truth had done in that quiet town, not forced, not rushed, just revealed in its own time. The air carried a coolness that belonged only to that hour, the space between night and day where everything feels suspended, like the land itself is holding its breath before beginning again. Ethan sat, steady in the saddle, his posture unchanged, his gaze forward. But there was something different now, something settled, not new, but clearer, like a line that had always been there had finally come into focus. The horse beneath him moved with quiet certainty, hooves finding the trail even where it faded into open ground, and Ethan let it lead for a while, trusting instinct over sight, the same way he had trusted what he saw in the dust back in that street. He did not think about the town in detail anymore. Not the faces, not the words, just the feeling of that moment when silence had turned into something else, something that could not be undone once it had begun. And somewhere in that memory, there was the image of Nayeli, standing not as someone broken by what had been placed on her, but as someone who had endured it without letting it define her. And that was the part that stayed, not the accusation, not the tension, just the quiet strength that followed. The horizon brightened a little more, a thin line of pale light stretching across the land, and with it came the slow return of color, the ground shifting from shadow into shape, the sky opening into something wider, something that promised nothing but possibility. Ethan adjusted his grip on the reins slightly, not to change direction, just to acknowledge the shift, and he let out a breath he had not realized he was holding, the kind that comes when a man knows something has come to an end without needing to name it. Behind him, the world he had passed through would continue. The town would wake, doors would open, voices would return, and with them would come choices, small ones at first, then larger ones, shaped by what had been uncovered, by what could no longer be ignored. Some would hold on to it, let it guide them. Others might try to forget, try to smooth it over the way the wind smooths the earth. But even then, the ground remembers. And so do the people who choose to look. Ethan did not need to be there to see it, did not need to return, because his part had never been to stay, only to stand when it mattered, and then to move on when the moment had passed. The light grew stronger, pushing the last of the night back, and the land stretched out ahead in full view once more, open, endless, carrying no trace of what had come before except what a man chose to carry within him. He reached up and adjusted his hat against the rising sun, the brim casting a familiar shadow over his eyes, and he leaned forward just enough to signal the horse to pick up its pace, not rushing, just continuing, always continuing. The rhythm of the ride settled again, steady and unbroken, and Ethan let it carry him into the day without looking back, because there was nothing left behind that needed him anymore. And somewhere far from where he rode, a girl who had once stood alone in a place that had judged her without knowing her now stood in a world that had been forced to see her clearly, not because someone had spoken for her, but because someone had refused to let the truth be buried beneath fear. That kind of moment does not end when the dust settles. It continues, quiet and unseen, shaping what comes next in ways no one can fully measure. And as Ethan rode into the widening light, the land opening before him like it always had, there was nothing dramatic in it, nothing that would be remembered in stories told loud and fast. But there was something else, something steadier, something that did not fade with distance or time. Out here, justice does not ride in with thunder or leave with applause. It arrives in silence, stands where it needs to stand, and then moves on without asking to be remembered, leaving behind only the truth it uncovered and the quiet strength of those who chose to see it. And for a man like Ethan Cole, that was enough, more than enough, to keep riding forward into whatever waited beyond the next rise, knowing that sometimes the greatest change comes not from what you do, but from what you refuse to ignore. Thanks for watching this story. Subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt stories. Your support helps keep these stories alive. Tell me in the comments what you felt about this story and what kind of stories you want to see next. See you in the next story.